So here's the situation. So it's the NCAA tournament. It's the NCAA tournament for men's basketball and women's basketball. March Madness, Sweet 16, you name it. The men are playing in Indianapolis. The women are playing in San Antonio. This year, I would say sports have been characterized by two things. One is COVID one is COVID and how do you play sports without fans? The second is around justice and equality. Like, if I think there have been two themes in sports in the last 12 months, it's those two themes. Clearly, the NCAA was not paying attention or didn't give a shit about any of this, because flash forward to the end of last week, there was a player, flash forward to the end of last week, pictures started to surface of the NCAA men's basketball weight room versus the women's NCAA basketball versus the men's weight room versus the women's weight room. The men's weight room was gorgeous. It's well laid out. It's completely stocked. It's got every type of equipment imaginable. And the women literally had like the one pyramid of barbells with like a folding table next to it. Like, no joke, that was the discrepancy. I think what's insane about this, so I think I have a lot of opinions about this. Everyone's been up in arms about it all weekend. I think the NCAA completely botched their response, which was to say there wasn't enough room to do this for the women in the way that there was room for men. Just as a quick reminder, I think the NCAA makes $834 million on TV rights from the men's tournament, and they make $42 million on the women's tournament. I don't think either one of those are chump change. Like, that's enough money to pay for the weight room. It gets even worse than that, though, where you started to see what the menu was in Indianapolis for the men. They had lobster mac and cheese. They had filet. It was all sorts of gourmet. They had tablecloths with settings. And then you pan over to the women's tournament, and the girls were eating basically like mystery meat and like some overcooked vegetables in plastic. Anyway, so not only was the inequity apparent in the weight room, the inequity became apparent in the meals, and then the inequity became further apparent. I read a New York Times article last weekend where the men's tournament have PCR tests, which are more accurate and obviously more expensive, whereas the women only had rapid tests, which are cheaper and easier to administer. So net, massive discrepancies across the board. I don't know what the NCAA was thinking in that this would not be surfaced in a year of equality and where athletes have taken their own platforms to create voice, to use their voices for justice. Personally, I don't think this is a bad thing that this happened. I think if there was a slight discrepancy in the weight room or there was a slight discrepancy in the meals, people could have explained it and rationalized it. I think the nature of the nature of the inequality will actually be good for women's sports because it's so egregious. The NCAA is going to have to do something about it. So I think that's one great thing that will come from this. I think the way the NCAA has managed it is so par for the course with the NCAA, which in my opinion has one of the worst brand reputations for any organization out there. They're known as being exploitative. They're known as being greedy. They are clearly very tone deaf and insensitive to what's happening culturally. And I think actually what the biggest downside for the NCAA is obviously they've got a massive PR crisis happening right now. And two, it's not a very, it's a slippery slope. When you start to look at gender discrepancies, it's very easy to parlay this conversation into how much money does the NCAA make? How much money does the NCAA make? How are they using that money? Who does that go to? How are they managing their tournaments? How are they managing their business? A lot of people are calling this a Title IX violation, and they're actually wrong. So what's interesting about this is that the NCAA is not federally funded. So because they're not federally funded, Title IX does not apply. So the NCAA is under no obligation by virtue of a federal law to create equality for their players. And it simply was, frankly, the right thing to do, whereby women and men would have, the female players and male players would have some semblance of the same accommodation. All right. So the reason Title IX does not apply to this particular situation is that the tournament itself is not federally funded, right? The universities have to play by Title IX. There's other organizations within sports and in basketball that have to abide by Title IX. The NCAA tournament does not. I think the other thing that's interesting is the NCAA got absolutely smoked for multiple reasons on social media. First, for saying there's not enough room. And then the second is that their rationale was that the women should not have been surprised about this because in the 90-page handbook that was given to them before arrival, the handbook stated that they would not have proper lifting facilities until the Sweet 16 because there wasn't enough room and the tournament would need to remove courts to create an adequate workout area. Also interesting to note is there were no weights over 30 pounds, which I think is just bullshit. Have you seen some of these female players? They're fucking strong. Like, these women can go 50. They can go 75. They can bench stuff. They can go up to the hundreds. Like, they can. So that is the latest with the NCAA. Here's my 2 cents on this. One is, like I said earlier, I think the gross nature of the discrepancy is probably the single best thing that could have happened for women's athletics. So I think this is a massive opportunity and is creating a level of visibility that would otherwise have been ignored. I think the second thing is I don't think that anyone is saying that the women's tournament yields as much revenue or drives as many eyeballs as the male tournament, as the men's tournament. And I think one of the things that is very hard right now in women's athletics at the college level and then certainly at the pro level, we've lived through this with hockey, is that when there's not a lot of money to go around, you can't expect the same type of accommodation. That's fair to say in for-profit businesses. If there were to be a viable professional women's hockey league, the minimum wage would not be the same as the NHL. I think the minimum player salary in the NHL is around $500K. That would not happen for a female hockey player, just by virtue of the fact that there's not enough eyeballs, there's not enough fans, there's not enough demand, and there's not enough money to go around. The NCAA and the NCAA tournament is a nonprofit, and we are talking about college athletes. We're talking about kids. And I think the difference here is that if you're looking at sports leagues and team owners who are in it as a business, and then you look at an educational institution, there's a sense that the educational institution should do the right thing and treat people equally. So that's my first take. I think my second take is I love how the players have taken this upon themselves and they're carrying the narrative of what's happening on the ground in the tournaments. Okay, so Sedona Prince from Oregon, she dropped this thing on TikTok. And what's interesting to our conversation about name, image, and likeness is this is exactly what's going to happen in the future. Is Sedona Prince is the PR department, she's the marketing vehicle, she's the broadcaster of the most interesting story coming out of the NCAA tournament. And that's here to stay. Nobody cares what ESPN has to say about it. Yes, people are reading the New York Times or the Washington Post piece on it, but when people really want to hear what's happening, they're turning to the athletes and to the players. And that is the era that we're living in. Social media prefers that. The algorithms will favor it. Other fans will appreciate it. So I think that's an interesting part of this story is really who is carrying the message of the story and how it's being broadcast. I think the third piece is the NCAA has done an extremely shitty job managing this. Like, it just shows a complete lack of understanding of optics. So I think the last piece of it is how the NCAA is managing this is extremely poor. One, to blame things on a lack of space. Two, to call out that there's some minute detail in a handbook. The reality is people feel that discrimination is happening in real time in one of the biggest, if not the biggest, most lucrative college sporting event of the year. And the NCAA let that happen. Like, I get how mistakes happen. I get that when you're running a women's tournament on one budget and you're running a men's tournament on another budget, you can get lost in those silos. You can get caught up in your work. Like, I don't think anyone is above making mistakes, but I don't know why the NCAA was like, you are so right. We fucked up. Let's make this right now. Because they have the money to do it. So just like speaking of the bumbling is Mark Emmert, who's the NCAA president, widely loathed individual, I would say, calls the situation inexcusable, but then goes on to blame the situation on a lack of communication due to COVID. And like, no offense, you can blame a lot on COVID. You can't blame a lack of communication on COVID. This is something that was fairly obvious, is now very glaring, and was frankly completely avoidable. If the weight room had maybe 10 racks versus one, or four pieces of equipment versus a single barbell, like, would people have had the outrage that they have now? Probably not, which is why I think ultimately this is a good thing. But I think it just shows that people are tone deaf and obtuse. And all right, so let me summarize this. All right, so in summary, here's my take on it. This will end up a good thing. It will change the NCAA. It will change the optics around women's athletics versus men. 2 is, I think this is going to be one of the straws that breaks the NCAA's back and furthers the narrative on their exploitation of players. We talked about name, image, and likeness, I think last episode or the episode before. I think this will expedite the amount of states that pass athletes' ability to monetize their own likeness and being. 3, I think this was completely avoidable. A lot of people are calling out that a lot of the executives at the NCAA are women, and that women made this decision. Newsflash, women fuck up too. So that, I don't think it matters what your gender is. I think it was a fuck up. It was a professional fuck up. So it doesn't matter where you come from, who you are, what gender you might be. And then the last thing is that the players are the broadcasters, and the news stories coming out of this tournament, the most interesting news stories are going to come from them, and that's a trend that will never change. All right, so now that we've talked about the NCAA, let's get into Google. So Google, for anybody who is interested in the ad business or likes the internet, there have been rumors for years that Google is going to be getting rid of third-party cookies. So third-party cookies are essentially little crumbs that all sorts of websites all over the internet drop onto your browser. They're little crumbs that websites all over the internet drop on you, so that when you are surfing and living your daily life on the internet, they can target you with the right ads. So you probably noticed that if you're out surfing on the web, when you go to any number of sites, you get served ads from a website that you've just been on. That's what cookies does. It enables advertisers, publishers, or brands to be able to target you with the products that you've just seen. So it's an intelligent way to serve advertising that's completely tailored and based on what your browsing experience has been. The majority of digital advertising has used cookies to be able to augment targeting and to be able to serve a more effective ad that has a far higher CPA or a far lower CPA, which is cost per acquisition. So essentially, what the internet has been doing since the late 90s is dropping cookies all over your profile. You can imagine yourself like walking around, and every place that you visited leaves a little mark on every place that you visited on the web leaves a mark. And then those companies are able to target you in the future. They're able to use your surfing data to be able to build profiles and essentially to run smarter advertising campaigns that target you not based on who you are, but target you based on who you are, what you've looked for, when you looked for it, where you looked for it, and to serve you something that will encourage you to buy that thing in the future. Now, what's interesting about this is that what Google is essentially doing, I am not sure how there is not like a bigger monopoly. I'm not sure how there aren't bigger monopoly conversations around Google. Google announced earlier this month that third-party cookies are over. So if consumers use the Chrome browser, so if you use Safari, you're fine. You're not using a Google browser. If you use Chrome, which is owned and created by Google, Google will not allow third-party sites to cookie you. They won't allow those sites to drop a marker on you that lets you that lets them target you and your behavior, lets them target you and serve ads to you in the future. This is going to have a dramatic impact on the ad business because so much of the digital ad business is predicated on display advertising. I think this sucks. I think we kind of botched how internet ads are managed. They're shitty. If you go to any standalone publisher right now, if you go to Forbes.com, if you go to thedailymail.com, you go to enews.com, you're served up with 100 ads. They are all sitting on top of each other. The video sound is running. It's just a shitty consumer experience. That's why I've refused to go so hard into that with Barstool. But what's happening is essentially if people go to those sites using a Chrome browser, it's not that you won't see targeted ads. You're just not going to see targeted ads from anyone but Google. And what Google is essentially saying is that third-party sites using their browsers cannot drop cookies on people. And the only way to target people with products that they've seen in a hope to convert them to buy is to use Google's ad products. So we talk about this a lot on this podcast. I have a large opinion about how the big social platforms are killing standalone brands and they're killing publishers. Now what's happening is Google is making a very dramatic move to kill third-party advertising. And the end result of this will be that advertisers will be forced to compete for these buys on Google. More ad dollars will move to Google. The price will go up because there's more competition on every user. And it essentially is going to dramatically change the way a large majority of digital advertising dollars work. I think it'll be good for podcasting. I think more people will move into podcasting. I think it will be good for video. More ad dollars will move into digital video. My hope is that TV dollars start to move more aggressively into video. You're already seeing that happen. I think you'll see more dollars move to influencers and into integrated social posts. But it's essentially a big blow, but it's essentially a very, very big blow it's essentially a very, very big blow to display advertising as current advertisers know it. So advertisers, the net for advertisers is they are going to have to find a new way to target consumers. They're going to find other digitally native mediums to do that. From a consumer perspective, I think a lot of consumers read news like this and they say, Google is doing such a favor for us. They are the champions of my privacy. They are going to protect my information. That's actually not true. What they're essentially doing is killing their competition. So Google is still going to track all users on mobile devices, all users on desktops, basically anybody who's using the Chrome browser, and they're going to target them in all of those places. They're still going to use your behavior. They're still going to track what you do, and they're still going to serve relevant advertising to you. They're just not going to let anybody else do it, and they're just not going to let anyone else do it alongside of them. All right, so within the package of Google getting rid of third-party cookies, they've also announced something called Google's Federated Learning of Cohorts. Who makes up phrases like that? What the fuck does that even mean? FLOC. So what Google is saying in their Federated Learning of Cohorts, that is just a terrible phrase. They're saying in this FLOC that this is a privacy-first This is a privacy-first advertising technology. So what Chrome is going to do is, instead of targeting individual users, Chrome is going to place users or audiences into cohorts based on those habits. And advertisers via Google will be able to target ads to those cohorts rather than to an individual user. I mean, to be honest with you, I'm sure they're probably doing this anyways. Advertisers aren't making customized ads. So what Google is trying to say is that they're still going to deliver targeted ads to you. It's just in a more anonymous and a less creepy way. Less data is going to be sent to third parties. More data is going to be concentrated with Google. More data will be centered with Google. Google will have more control and more autonomy. Again, there's no checks and balances on this. They will own the algorithm. They will control the algorithm. They are going to control the vehicle with which advertisers will reach consumers. I think what's interesting here is, from a consumer perspective, nobody gives a shit about your privacy. All the platforms want to make more money. They want more control. They want more unregulated autonomy. They want to be able to create vertical integration. In this case, Google is just essentially killing its competition and centralizing and controlling the ability to target to you on their browser. Okay. And then the last thing I think is interesting about this is I think one of the things you're going to see in the future is whoever owns the interface controls the algorithm, controls the data, and that party will endeavor to own the consumer. So you're going to see these battles. There'll be the battle for Chrome. Google is making a big statement on Chrome. It will be the entry point to Chrome from an advertising perspective. You look at Apple. How does Apple start to play ball here in terms of how does Apple start to play ball here in terms of what's allowed on your user interface for your phone? What's allowed in iOS? Are they going to do the same thing for Safari? I think that will be very interesting. Facebook will do the same on their platform. So I think the bigger piece of this is, as you look at the FANG companies, and in particular, you look at Google, you look at Apple, you look at Facebook, and you look at Amazon, you're going to start to see them try to control the entire consumer experience. And I think you'll see a lot more battles in this because they are interdependent on each other. Everyone is dependent on Apple to be able to have their apps run on iOS. Same is true for Android. So it'll be interesting to see the power dynamics between the giants. What's essentially happening is the small guy is getting killed and pushed off the cliff along the way. All right, so last weekend I spent the weekend in Florida. I got the opportunity to go to WWE's Fastlane pay-per-view, which was incredible. I cannot say enough about the brilliance and the sophistication and just the scrappiness of WWE's production. They blow me away. It's so interesting. It's inspiring coming from a Barstool perspective where, we were having a conversation with someone on Saturday night about how when the pandemic started, there was a lot of pressure on the WWE to keep the show running. So many other productions stopped. So many other live events companies just threw in the towel, not the WWE. And what they did was essentially to stitch together all different types of technology to reformulate how a wrestling match and a production would take place, how they would think about creating a virtual crowd. Like everybody else went to the cardboard cutouts. WWE invested millions of dollars into dynamic screens where the crowd was visually and viscerally a part of the experience. And what was interesting is they were talking about how they got smarter week after week after week of the pandemic, where they got smarter about the cost of things, the production of things. They got savvier about how they coached up their talent to think about performing in a dark room with no crowd. They got proactive in, one of the things that I will always take away from me from the WWE experience is how they think about sound and how sound leads emotion. and how they use sound to move the crowd, in this case, a virtual crowd, and they use sound to move the superstar. And I just think it's so sophisticated and smart how they have thought about the product that they create. I think the most inspiring thing about Vince McMahon is just he thinks about things from a fan perspective. It gives me comfort from a Barstool perspective because I see so many similarities, obviously, between Dave and Vince, but also in what Vince and his team are doing and what we're trying to do. Like we were talking about WrestleMania, and Vince was saying he has a gasp every time he sees the price of a WrestleMania ticket. Like, can you believe people are paying for this? And he's been in this business for decades. And I feel the same way. Like we were discussing Rough and Rowdy, and would we increase the price of Rough and Rowdy? And the thought of going above $20 on Rough and Rowdy gives me a little like agita, because I'm like, do we think people will pay for that? And I think to have such an appreciation of the product that you create for fans, and they also walk a fine line of the product they build for the networks they're on and the product that ultimately resonates with their consumer. And I don't know, it was incredible to see Fastlane in action, and it was inspiring to be around a company that thinks so wholly about what the product is and how to make a creative product great. I wish there were more companies like that. I felt that, Vince and I were talking about, where do you put the camera if you're trying to show someone in a ring and someone off stage? And what he was saying is that most people would put the camera behind the shoulder of the person off stage so that you see the person in the ring. And what he was saying is, no, you have to do it differently, because you always have to have eyes like the fan. And the eyes like the fan looks over the wrestler's shoulder to the person off stage. And just little things like that, which make a huge difference in the point of view of the product and the point of view of the creative, which I think, I just think is so interesting to think about things in a way that is that simple and that sophisticated. The other thing we were talking about is I was saying how much I like Roman Reigns. Like, I like Roman Reigns because not because he's good looking. All the other board people were like, you just like him because he's good looking. I don't really give a fuck that he's good looking. I like that I'm not sure that he's evil. And I like that he has a glimmer that, his smile is great. He's got great teeth, but I'm not sure if he's a good guy or a bad guy at heart. And what Vince was saying is that everyone has to start in a box. People like boxes. You have to start in a box. But if you show glimpses of being something other than what people expect from you in your box, that's where stories get really interesting. And I think that's very true in storytelling in general. I think it's certainly true of Barstool. It made me start to think about our personalities and what boxes they're in and what glimpses they can give of something else, which I think is a really powerful tool in storytelling and a really powerful tool in content. So long story short, I've been here in a board capacity. I flew to Chicago to be with Dave for our board meeting, where we're the operators of the company. I don't know if our board meetings are different than other companies. I've actually really enjoyed seeing how different. One of the best things that happened for me in 2020 and 2021 was starting to see how other companies run and manage themselves, and how they manage their boards, and how they manage the discussion that they have with their boards. One of the things, one of the things that I'm trying to do a better job of is we're always running like 1,000,000 miles an hour, and there's 100 fire drills, and things are going wrong constantly. And we just we just move so breathtakingly fast. It's sometimes hard to stop and say, okay, here's where we are. Here's where we're going. Here's what we're trying to say. Here's what we need. Those things feel very simple, but in the moment, it can be hard to take that step back and look at where you are. I'm also trying to do a better job of communicating. Like, my goal for this board meeting was that I was going to talk to everyone on our board before the board meeting and say, here's what we're doing. Here's what we're looking at. Here's what you should expect, which I think are things that help make a meeting go better in general. But it's also those little things that you always leave to the last minute, or you lose sight of because you're rushing to do something else. So we had our board meeting on Monday. We had a 64-page deck. So I've spent the weekend building a 64-page deck. Shout out Ali Racheski. She suffers through this thing right along with me. Here's how we generally talk about our board stuff is this is our Q1 board meeting. So I always like to look back. The last time we met with our board was in October. So the first thing was like, hey, how'd we do in 2020? Good. The great thing is we crushed 2020. I think 2020 outperformed really every expectation that we had for Barstool Sports. It was a hard year. It was an emotional year. It was a difficult year. It was a challenging year by virtue of how much change it prompted and how alienating it was. It also wasn't without its controversy and kind of its fissures and fractures. I also had this moment in like December of last year being like, fuck, we're going to so greatly surpass where I thought we would be from a revenue perspective and an EBITDA perspective. It just sets a new threshold and level of where we have to get the year after. I think one of the things that's always hard for a CFO or a CEO is you're trying to call the ball on where you think you'll be at the end of a year. I think one of the unique things about Barstool is that we never really know exactly where we're going to be. That's something Dave and I've always been really aligned on. We'd rather make the most of the moment versus planning out for what we think something could be. I think that's a huge part of our success. It was interesting. I was asking Vince on the plane on the way to the WWE. I was asking him, how early he has the shows ready. Like, how in advance is Fastlane produced? Is it done? And we were talking and, he's like, spontaneity, we're in a business where spontaneity matters. And a little bit of a chaos at the finish line is a great thing because it means that it's real. It means that it's vibrant. It means that you're reacting to exactly what's happening right now. And it means the emotion around it is real. I feel the same on the business perspective. I don't think we could have anticipated. We kind of saw the Caller Daddy drama coming in 2020. We didn't anticipate how big Dave would be in finance. We didn't anticipate the Barstool Fund. We didn't anticipate all of the racial unrest last summer and what that would do to us and what that would do to our partners. And then I also feel really proud when I look back on 2020 is that, we made a lot of content pivots. We started to launch the sports book. We brought in people like Logan Paul and Nick Merckx to help us do that. Like, we're growing the moat around our own business. We leaned into TikTok in an incredible way. The Viceroys, which is our college network, I think is going to be incredibly important for us. When we started the Viceroys, and the Viceroys are really Gaz's baby, the Viceroys enabled us in the early days in 2016, or my early days here, to look bigger than we were. It enabled us to trend and to dupe Twitter into thinking we were a big company and something big was happening when in reality there were 30 colleges talking about it. Now our Viceroy program is becoming a big moneymaker for us. It's a massive platform for talent. We're going to announce in the next couple weeks that we're going to be looking for video editors and producers coming out of college, not just social people and personalities. Like, I'm really fired up for what that network can become. In the context of a board meeting, there's entire companies. I think there's a company called Black Sheep. Like, there are entire companies that are dedicated to figuring out college, managing a college network. We're managing a college network and we don't even talk about it. And we now have, 1,000, 1,200 kids that work for us on that. It's over $1 million business for us. We do that between 9 and 9:15 a.m. on a Wednesday. So I think one of the interesting things about our board conversations are always, here's what we're seeing, here's what we're doing. What we haven't been great at is, here's what we want to focus on and lean into. And I think that's okay because so much of what we lean into is organic. Obviously, you've seen the impact on the Penn stock. We leaned into Penn. Obviously, people see the impact on the sports book. We're leaning into the sports book. Obviously, people see the impact on content. We're leaning into content. And you can see, $1 million worth of game. Dion, we're diversifying our talent. Brianna Chicken Fry, Alyssa, Sydney, we're deepening our female talent. Shows like Surviving Barstool, like we're starting to lean into longer form content. I think you're going to see us do a better job in 2021 of being not just audio first, but being video and audio simultaneously, promoting and distributing things socially, better harnessing our talent and personalities to do so. And those are the types of bets that we're going to make. So those are the types of conversations I think we'll have in our board. We'll talk about our commerce business. We'll talk about the impact of the Barstool Fund. I mean, I think one of the unexpected benefits of the Barstool Fund, not only in helping small businesses around this country, which is by far the most important, there were millions and millions, if not a billion media impressions around Barstool Sports that just came out of that goodwill. When you look at people who bought t-shirts or sweatshirts supporting different restaurants, 60% of them were new to Barstool. Those are people they weren't stoolies. They weren't with us from the beginning. So those are the types of things we talk about, which is, what is it that we've done? What have we learned about what we did? And how is that going to create opportunity for us going forward? And how do we start to understand the new fans, the new people, the new products that we can create to deepen that relationship? You can't just sugarcoat everything. I think that's important. I had a call this morning with someone who was like, what's the negative? What's the negative? What's the negative? And I think we're just such a self-critical group. I mean, Dave's in Illinois right now bitching at our sales team because he had to bet on some god-awful NCAA team. So Dave's completely eviscerating talent like Willie and Large and Nick and KB for not promoting the Bracket Busters, which I think is awesome. I love that about our company. I think it's bullshit. Like, how do these people think we pay for them? We pay for them from advertisers. The opportunity to participate in the draft is an opportunity. It's just that. People are competing to win a blockchain, which is a fuck ton of money. And the least they could do is to promote their team. And I think it's not just those guys. Like, where's Liz? Where are people? Like, why aren't they promoting what they're doing? And I think I like about us that we keep things real and we keep things critical pretty constantly. I'm sure people don't like it. Obviously, it's hard to get called out to the table. It doesn't feel good. But my hope is that makes us better in the long run. I think the lowlights in our world are, I think this is a funny year for an upfront. I think most media companies, whether you're a traditional media company or a digital media company, the upfront is soft. Upfronts are very important because the upfront just gives you a bank of revenue and some assurance about what your financial future is going to look like for the rest of the year. We saw a flat upfront from 2020 to 2021. Typically, companies like to see a 10% increase, a 20% increase, a 30% increase in the upfront. So I think a flat upfront is something a lot of companies are seeing. We have had a lot of highlights in our upfront. We've closed an automotive advertiser. We closed a telco advertiser. Those were big things for me because I think once you make it into automotive and telco, there's really nothing you can't do. But seeing softening in the ad market or uncertainty in the ad market, which everyone is seeing right now, is obviously of concern. My personal belief is that advertising is going to come roaring back as consumers come roaring back towards the back half of this year. Second thing is social media policies. I think social media policies is something that anyone in my shoes or who's thinking about programming or who's thinking about content or products has to be aware of. The way that the social networks are managing their community guidelines and their policies, and the way that the social networks are managing their community guidelines and their policies is going to have a dramatic impact on content. And it's going to have a dramatic impact on third-party brands' ability to grow on those platforms. Oh, shit. I think the other thing I always worry about is stagnation. Like, how do we make sure that all of our brands are growing? And what is it going to take to get those brands to grow? I think that 2020 is a year where we will get fatter, not taller. And I think getting fat is a good thing in this regard, whereby brands, Chiclets is a great example. Chiclets was a podcast. Chiclets can be gaming. Chiclets is a live stream. Chiclets is a vodka. Chiclets is a tour. And so what we're really focused on is how are we growing our brands wider versus taller. Foreplay, another great example. Foreplay is a pod. Foreplay is a video series led by Riggs. Daily 9, 4-man scramble. It's a golf tour. But all of those things are predicated on the hosts and the talent associated with each of those brands having the grit, having the time, having the energy, having the point of view to be able to proliferate that content. Dave does a great job of this. Dave's a unicorn. Dave also has a system that he has built around himself that puts pizza reviews out at 6 p.m. on every platform every day. And we need that across all of our brands. I think podcasting is in trouble. I think most podcasts are down. I think podcasts are about to be over monetized. And I think that you are seeing, it's funny. I had a conversation this past weekend of like, oh, Erika, podcasts. I have all these people approaching me about, should we make a podcast? And I'm like, you're too late to make a podcast. And just because you're a good music artist, or just because you're a good athlete, or just because you're an interesting executive doesn't mean you can have a great podcast. I don't think I'm even good at having a podcast. I'm still trying to figure it out. But to have a breakout success podcast is extremely hard. It's like trying to get to the top of the heap at YouTube. You can't, the podcast industry is maturing and saturated in such a way that it's getting to be more and more difficult to break through and resonate in that medium. So if you look at the Shoot Your Shot girls on Clubhouse, I think they were brilliant to choose Clubhouse to launch Shoot Your Shot. If those women had decided to just do that as a podcast, I think it would have been way harder for them to break through. And maybe Shoot Your Shot will turn into a podcast. But we say this all the time to our talent, which is, don't go try to follow the path that Dan took or Dave took or necessarily even Alex Cooper took. Find your own place to have your own path. Maybe it's on Clubhouse. Maybe it's on TikTok. Maybe it's on OnlyFans. But the need to think about growing brands in new places is critically important. Obviously, we'll look at 2021. One thing I really care about is the diversification of our revenue and not being dependent on any one source of income at any given time. I think this is important. Interestingly enough, last year, 2020, was the first year where our commerce business surpassed our advertising business. I think a lot of people saw commerce businesses explode. I think this is a great sign for us. Selling merch is something we control. Nobody can take that away from us. Advertising is obviously a far more complicated, far more nuanced dance. And then the other things we're going to talk about, or the other things we talked about, is what's happening in the industry. I think, when I look at the landscape, I think that most traditional players are driving to their subscription models. So NBC, HBO, ESPN, Viacom, Disney, Discovery, Paramount, everyone is going to drive consumers to subscribe to subscribe to their D2C product. That's the first thing happening. Second is those companies will try to feed those subscription services either by buying up rights, which they've all mostly done at this point, commissioning original content, which many are doing. And then three, they'll play all sorts of games about, you can watch this for free, but you have to subscribe to get more. You've seen this happen with the digital print companies. You're now going to see it happen in video. My point of view is that we are going to be free and we are going to be everywhere. And I think the big difference is that we are a company and a brand and a collection of brands which have incredible upside and want to find new audiences. So in a stark contrast to what I see most of the traditional people doing, I believe that we can be the network of the future. And the more places we put our content and the more and simpler opportunities we provide brands to be integrated with those, and the more places we organically put our commerce, the better off we're going to be. We can build more brand, we can build more IP, we can create more products, we can find more fans, we can gain more followers. And that to me is what the network of the future is going to look like. And that's what I'm interested in. So that's our board meeting in a nutshell. We'll talk about finance. We'll obviously talk about the sports book. We'll talk about a lot of our licensing missing opportunities. We'll talk about our partnerships. We'll talk about our people, which is really important. One of the good things I think about a board session is to just take a step back and look at the company overall. It's interesting to see the average age of a Barstool employee is 30 years old. When you look at the business team and the content team, the average tenure is about 2.5 years. We have 250 people here now. We look a lot at turnover. And one of the things we're starting to pay attention to is where do we have higher turnover and lower turnover? What's good attrition versus bad attrition? We've talked about that. Where do we need to invest? One of the things I always worry about with us is are we running too fast, too thin? We publish an additional 20,000 videos every month. We have over 550,000 videos which have not been properly tagged. How do we as a company harness what we're doing and get a better system to take care of it? So those are the things we'll talk about at our board meeting. I think being on a board is a completely different, there's a completely different responsibility. I think what's important for a board member, and I felt this last weekend with the WWE, is to be enthusiastic about that company. Their executives taking time to educate you on their business is an honor. It's a luxury. It's a responsibility. I was laughing at myself on Saturday afternoon, trying to get dressed up to go fly to Tampa. And I'm it's Saturday. It's 60 degrees. I want to be in a t-shirt and shorts. And instead I'm in a dress and, fixing my hair. But it's a sign of respect to a company that is enabling me to have a front row seat on their business. So I think the biggest thing as a board member is to be respectful of that position, to offer your opinion when asked, to be a cheerleader and to be enthusiastic for what that company creates, to be critical of opportunities that company may be missing or not thinking about, and to be proactive. I think to be proactive in how you offer value or support or counsel or perspective or insight. So that's the board section of this podcast. So that's it.